Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tom Reynolds. I'm with Export Solutions, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, which is about U.S. customs and imports. Normally, we spend a lot of our time talking about exports and export compliance, but today we're going to shift gears for a little bit and focus on the import side of the business. So I know that a number of you are still arriving, and I'm going to just spend the first few minutes talking about some housekeeping things. Then I will introduce our speaker today, who is Marcy Gentry from our team, and we'll go ahead and get started. Just some quick pointers on how this webinar works. Hopefully you can all hear my voice and see these slides. There's two ways that we can do audio. One of them is through the phone, and another one is through your computer speakers. Either option will work. However, I will tell you that for just technical issues and to keep things flowing smoothly, everybody on the call today is muted and will remain muted throughout this call. So we're not going to do live Q&A. Instead, we're going to manage the Q&A through the toolbar feature on your webinar. So if you have questions as we go through this, we'll be stopping at various points. Just feel free to type those questions into the Q&A, and then when we pause, we will be happy to address those. One of the most frequent questions that we get, and we will go ahead and answer it now for you, is how do we get a copy of the slides? That's pretty easy for us to answer. There's actually, we are recording this session, so there's going to be a recording of the audio and video, and we'll also have a copy of the slides in PDF format. Both of those will be accessible through our website, which is exportsolutionsinc.com. If you go to our home page and you click the webinar button at the top middle of that page, that will take you to the section of our website where you can download the slides and also view a recording of this session. I would say give it about a week. It usually takes us about a week to post all of that onto our site. So if you check back around this time next week, those materials should be available for all of you to use. Just wanted to talk to you quickly, too, about our next webinar that we're hosting. We do a series of free webinars throughout the year. And this next one that is going to be coming up is called 5 Questions to Answer About Denied Party Screening. So that is going to be 2 months from now on the second Wednesday of October. And you can sign up for that on our website as well on the same page that's shown here. Okay, for now I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speaker today. And her name is Marcy Gentry. Marcy is our senior consultant. And just a little bit of background about Marcy and her expertise. She has about 17 years of direct experience working in trade compliance for a number of Fortune 500 companies, including firms like Dell Computer, Freescale Semiconductor, BAE Systems, L3, and Nortel Networks. Marcy has a lot of background and knowledge on EAR, ITAR, and other foreign country import-export regulations. She has been a licensed U.S. Customs broker since 2004, and she's a graduate of the University of Colorado at Denver, where she majored in international business. Marcy's also a member of the International Compliance Professionals of America Association, or the ICPA, if any of you are familiar with that, and has been in the Central Texas chapter of the Women in International Business. She was also a adjunct professor teaching import and supply chain processes at the Austin Community College International Business Institute. So Marcy joins us today from just outside Dallas, Texas. And are you there, Marcy?
I am. Thank you.
All right, great. I will turn it over to you then to talk to us about imports.
Great. Thank you. So let's just go first through the agenda. Today we'll be talking about the imports and the roles of a customs broker and the role of customs and the importer. So those of you that have been importing for a long time, this is probably just a refresher to what the process is. But this particular webinar is just to give you an overview of the customs process. So if you're not familiar with how customs works in the U.S. and the different roles that are played, then we will be going through what those different items are. The first thing that we'll go through is the role of the importer, then the role of the customs or customs, border, and protectionist, the role of the customs broker, and then the importing process. We'll also go through what are the best practices to ensure that your products are being imported properly to avoid delays in the shipping process, and then just a quick overview as to what you should look at when you're choosing a customs broker. And as we go through, as Tom pointed out earlier, we'll have various spots in the webinar to ask questions. So once again, just go ahead and click on the chat button and enter your questions there. So the first part is the role of the importer. So one of the main things that I get a lot of questions about is who is the importer in the transaction. Well, the importer of record, which is the person that's responsible for the items being imported, they're the ones that will be paying the duties. They're the ones that are acting on behalf of, or acting to import the goods, the ones that are wanting the items to be imported.
Hey, Marcy?
Yes.
Marcy, can I stop you real quick? We're having some audio issues. It sounds like somebody is unmuted. So I'm just going to pause you for a second and mute everyone, and then I'm going to unmute Marcy so that she can continue to talk to make sure that everyone else is muted. So hang on one second, Marcy.
Okay. Thanks. Hopefully everybody can hear me now.
Yes, thanks.
Perfect. So who is the actual importer of record? So the importer of record will be the owner of the products that are being imported, the purchaser of the products that are being imported. So the purchaser may not own the goods at the time that they're being imported, so that's why we distinguish between those two. In addition, the licensed customs broker may be designated by the owner or the purchaser to be the importer of record. What I will caution you on is that most customs brokers will not act as the importer of record because there's liability issues. Customs broker may just submit the paperwork, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but just realize that the licensed customs broker could be the importer of record if they're designated by the owner or purchaser. Another entity is the consignee. It can also act as the importer of record. The key here is to determine who is the importer of record is that there has to be an evidence of the right to make entry. And generally that's done through the airway bill or the bill of lading, the shipped to entity or the sold to entity that's listed on the airway bill or the bill of lading, or even on the commercial invoice is the evidence that you have of the right to make entry. So what is the role of the importer? What are your responsibilities? The importer has a lot more responsibilities now than they used to. Customs did have more responsibilities before they did the Modernization Act, or the MOD Act. That was back in the early 2000 time frame. And what that has changed is what is the responsibility of the importer. So for example, the importer is responsible for the assignment of the correct harmonized tariff schedule number, or the HTS number, whereas customs was responsible for that years ago. That role has changed, and it now is the responsibility of the importer to assign the correct harmonized tariff schedule number. In addition to that, the importer is responsible for submitting all the paperwork to CBP, whether that's through your customs broker or if you're a self-filer, meaning you're sending your documents directly to customs yourself, you're responsible for making sure that all the correct documents get to customs. You want to make sure that all of the values are correct on that documentation. So there are a lot of questions I usually get from some of our clients as to what value do I use. Well, there's 3 different methodologies of value which we could spend a whole nother webinar on, and just valuation. But the value is generally the transaction value, so the purchase price of the goods. If it's an internal company transfer, that's going to be the transfer price between the 2 companies. So you always want to make sure that you have the correct value on there. In addition to that, there are things like assists that are required. You have to put assist values, and then you have to discount. So if you're providing a discount if you're receiving a discount for the products because you purchased a certain amount of products from the supplier overseas, you want to make sure that your documentation reflects the discount price. For an assist includes anything that you may have provided to the overseas supplier or manufacturer free of charge. The value of those items have to be added into your value of your products. Let me give you an example. If you provide molds or materials, if you're a textile manufacturer and you provide fabric to a manufacturer who just sews and puts the products together, the textiles together, you have to add in the price of the textiles into the value of the final goods that are coming in. And assists are another one of those things that could take a whole nother hour just to explain on that level. But if you do have questions or concerns on that, you can get back to us on the assists. You also have to make sure that you have the correct country of origin. And the country of origin is where the products are manufactured. And in some cases, you may be required to give a certificate of origin. And things like free trade agreements like NAFTA or the GSP or CAFTA agreements, you may be required to provide a specific certificate of origin, like a NAFTA certificate of origin. You also want to make sure that the correct quantity is on the commercial invoice. And when we talk about quantity, you have to use the correct unit of measure that's required for customs purposes. So while you may be selling items that you sell at, let's say, at each per unit, the measurement on the harmonized tariff schedule number may be meters squared, or it could be in ounces, and not necessarily bottle each. So you want to make sure you have that correct quantity that's listed on there. Also, you want to make sure that you provide a good description to customs. Once again, the description is something that customs uses to determine that what your products are classified as is correct with the description. And then in any other government agency documents, you'll hear customs and customs brokers refer to OGA, that really stands for other government agencies. And when we say other government agencies, there's things like the Federal Drug Administration. So if you're bringing in things like drugs and food, you do need to make sure you have the specific documents for that. Things like computers and electronics may require an FCC certification. So those other documents also have to be submitted at the time of import. And then, of course, you're responsible for any duties, payments of duties and fees to customs. So what is the role of CBP, or Customs and Border Protection? I'll just refer to CBP as Customs all the way through, since they've changed their name since 9/11. We'll just refer to them as Customs. But Customs' role is actually pretty large. And Customs is really an enforcement agent, and they look at controlling and regulating any imports and the movement of carriers and people in and out of the United States. So they don't only just deal with imports, they also deal with exports. They get involved with products as well as passenger aircraft that go in and out. So those are the types of things that they get involved with, as well as they're responsible for protecting consumers and the environment against hazardous toxic type products. So they're making sure that any type of chemicals that come in have been reviewed and certified to come in. They're making sure that there's no waste products that may be coming in. So they do look at all the products that do come in for hazardous and toxicity of the product. They protect domestic industry and labor against unfair, corrupt foreign competition. And in particular, we look at the anti-dumping laws. So what they are trying to protect are things like, a good example is ball bearings. There are a bunch of Chinese companies that are well known for selling ball bearings very, very cheap to the U.S. market, so that they throw the American manufacturers of ball bearings so that they can't compete. So what they're trying to do with these anti-dumping laws is to increase the taxes and duties that are assigned to those ball bearings to make sure that it's a fair and competitive market for the U.S. manufacturers. They also look at detecting, banning, and investigating smuggling of things like drugs and narcotics and arms and munitions types products that are coming into the U.S. They are also responsible for detecting and banning and investigating fraudulent activities intended to avoid payment of duties and taxes and fees. So really they're looking at the paperwork to make sure that the value is correct and that you're paying the appropriate duties assessed to the imports. One of the things that most people don't realize is most of the money that was raised by the government up until like the 40s, I believe, was done through U.S. customs taxes and duty payments. That's now that our practices have changed of doing this free trade, this is why other methods of tax have come into play, such as your income tax. But one of the things that Customs does look at is how you're paying those dues and taxes, and to make sure that you're paying the proper payment. They will also look at things such as currency and looking at arms and munitions items that are being imported into the different ports, and investigating for terrorist activities at U.S. ports of entry. One of the things I want to point out is that Customs acts as the enforcement entity for many of the U.S. government entities. So when you're bringing things in that have to comply with FCC regulations or FDA regulations, Customs will review the imports of those goods, and they will act as the enforcement agent. So they will stop your shipments, they will send you fines and penalties, and they will also notify these government agencies that there may be issues. So you may be dealing with two different issues or different agencies if you have a violation under the import regulations for some of these other regulations. And I'll stop there and see if there's any questions so far.
Yes, we have a couple questions coming in. The first one is, this is on values, listing values. Do we list values in U.S. dollars or in the currency of the country we are importing from?
So when you list the valuation on your paperwork, there are a couple of things that you can do. You can list the foreign value. You just need to make sure that you're putting the currency on the commercial invoice so that the customs broker knows what the appropriate money exchange is. So you don't always have to do it in U.S. dollars, but you do, let's say if you're bringing it in Japanese yen, you do need to make sure that people realize it's the yen. I always recommend that you do all of the paperwork. Well, not necessarily the importer would do the paperwork, but the exporter in the foreign country would do the paperwork, and I would always request that they would put it into U.S. dollars. That would prevent any type of valuation problems as it's going through the entry process. And I've seen numerous times where there are mistakes because the customs brokers usually get a lot of documentation and they just miss that it's in yen versus dollars. So, but you can list it on your commercial invoice in a foreign currency.
Okay, great. Thank you. Next question is, what is the value limitation on an informal entry, Section 321?
I'm actually going to save that for a little bit later because I do have that, and we go through the types of entries.
Okay. That's all we have for now. So if anybody, just a reminder, folks, if you have questions, feel free to submit them through the questions toolbar or the chat toolbar on your on GoToWebinar, and then we'll stop again in a few minutes and address those for you.
Sure. So the next section here is the role of the customs broker. So most people are questioning, what will the customs broker do for me? Well, under the regulations, under 19 CFR, which is the import regulations, section 111.1 is the definition of a customs broker. And the customs broker means a person who is licensed under this part to transact customs business on behalf of others. And so the key here is customs business, and we'll explain what customs business is here on the next slide. But one of the things I want to point out to you is that if you hire a customs broker, you do have to have a power of attorney in place for that customs broker to perform customs business on your behalf. And it's a normal power of attorney, really just grants them the right to provide documentation on behalf of your company to the U.S. government or to customs. And you don't need to have a power of attorney in place if you have a customs broker that works for your company and your company is self-filing or submitting the documentation directly to customs. It's generally when you're doing business on behalf of others. So the customs broker is submitting documents and paperwork to customs or performing customs business on behalf of another company or another entity. So let's talk about what customs business means. Customs business is also defined under 19 CFR 111.1, which is the definition section for that section of 19 CFR. But customs business really involves any entry of merchandise. So this means any of the documentation that's submitted to customs, preparing those documents, sending them through the automated broker interface system to customs, representing your company on behalf to customs. So if you have an exam that's done by customs and someone has to be there while they're opening the packages, your customs broker can represent you. Customs business also is defined as classification and valuation. So if you have your customs broker assign the HTS code or come up with a policy or or assignment evaluation for your products, that's also considered customs business. Any payments of duties, taxes, and fees is also customs business. And what I want to point out here is that your customs broker can pay for your entries up front, and then you can pay your customs broker later. And that's the way a lot of these things work. Saves the importer money so that they only pay their customs broker once a month or every 45 days. It's kind of however you work that out with your customs broker. In addition to that, if your customs broker does anything like refunds, rebates, or drawbacks of your duties and taxes, that's also a customs business. One of the things I want to make sure that you also understand is if they respond to any types of inquiries from customs, such as requests for additional information, or if they submit corrections in your entries, that's also customs business. And so that was a couple short slides, but just wanted to see if there was any questions in regards to customs brokers.
This is a question, Marcy, from the previous section, but they're wanting to know where can they find a list of the OGAs, other government agencies. Do you know a central place where that would be listed somewhere?
It's kind of throughout the regulations. If you go to Customs website, there is a lot of helpful guides and pamphlets that are out there for other government agencies, but to be honest with you, there's no central location. The other thing you may want to do is if you have a customs broker and you have your harmonized tariff schedule number assigned to your products, you can go to your customs broker and ask them, are there any government agency requirements per this HTS code? So kind of how it works in the customs system, which is the automated broker interface, or the ABI system, is that per HTS number they have checks as to what could be subject to other government agencies. So for example, if you have a computer classification under 8471, under that they will have a check for possibility of FDA requirements or FCC requirements. So it doesn't mean that your product's actually subject to that, and what you'll have to do then is go to the FCC regulations or the FDA regulations to see if your product's subject to it. So there's not really one general or localized place to find all those regulations, but your customs broker is actually a good place to start, that they can help you determine what other government regulations apply to that HTS code, because it's not in the harmonized tariff schedule if your item is subject to those other regulations.
Okay, great. Here's another question. Do you know of any drawbacks of setting up ACH payments directly to customs? We are looking at doing the monthly payment, and it will save us the disbursement fee charged by the broker.
You know, it's really a business decision. I've been with companies where we've looked at both ways. It depends on how much those payments are, so you have to look at how much duty you're paying. Does it make sense for you to draw the interest on that money for a month's time frame and pay the fee to the broker? Or if your duty payments are are minimal, then it may make more sense to do the direct payment. So you really just have to look at the business case to determine what's the best practice for your company.
Okay. Next question here. If the country of origin submitted to customs was different after inspection, meaning marking on the actual part, what would the company need to do? Would we need to send a new submittal?
Can you ask that again? I'm sorry, Tom.
Yeah, so if the country of origin submitted to customs was different after inspection, and then in parentheses it says marking on the actual part, so it looks like the country of origin changes after inspection, what would the company need to do? Would we need to send a new submittal?
You would have to do a correction to your entry. You know, you would have to look to see if there's any differences in the way that the duty was. So, for example, if you submitted the product and it said it qualified for NAFTA, and then after you opened the package and you saw the country of origin was for China, then your item no longer qualifies for NAFTA. So you have a certain time period that you can go back to customs and correct the entry, and that you should do that as soon as possible. Once the entry is liquidated, and we'll show that time frame here in the next couple of slides, it's very hard to go back and change those entries, and Customs doesn't like it, and they'll generally penalize you if you go back to do a disclosure and change those entries. But you can do an entry correction, and you should do that as soon as possible, as soon as you find out the country of origin.
Great, thank you. So we can keep going at this point, and we'll stop again at some point for questions.
Okay. So the next piece is the import process. So I thought it was prudent to go through and kind of walk you through what the import process is. Generally, and we'll take it as a transaction as a sale of goods from overseas to the U.S. So you generally start with a purchase order from the company in the U.S. and sends it to the supplier overseas. The supplier takes the purchase order, they make the product, manufacture the product, and get it ready for shipping. The next piece is that the supplier would package the products, they create the documentation such as the commercial invoice, and then any supporting documentation that's required, such as the certificate of origin. The other thing I would caution here is that if your products do require things like FCC certification, that you would ensure that your supplier has those FCC certifications in place, or FDA certifications. And in some cases, when you're dealing with chemicals, the Toxic Substance Chemical Act certification and the TSCA statement would be done prior to the item getting into the U.S. Otherwise, you're going to have to wait for those things to be done. And in most cases, the FCC or FDA certification takes months to do. You're going to have to send your shipment back. Otherwise, Customs will seize it because you only have a certain time period that you can enter those products in and complete your documentation once the item reaches the port of entry into the U.S. So one of the things I would suggest is that when you're buying from the supplier, make sure that you know all the requirements of your products before they're imported into the U.S. and that they can supply all that documentation to you. Generally, companies that have products that require FDA or FCC certification or TSCA statements will have it on their website. So you'll just want to take a look at their website and see if they have that information readily available. If not, put it in your purchase order, the requirements for that, and ask them to send that documentation to you up front before the products ship. The next thing that happens is that the products are either picked up from the dock of the supplier or they're delivered to the carrier's port or carrier's dock. Then the items are taken from, depending on the mode of transport, either the airport, the dock where the ship is being done, or from the truck, and sent and arrive into the port of import or port of entry into the U.S. Once the items get into the port of entry, and I'll use an air shipment for an example, the items are removed from the aircraft and then they're put into what they call a bonded warehouse at the airport until the documents and the entries have been made through Customs. And what happens is that your Customs broker would then go get the documents from the freight forwarder, or from the carrier, take those documents, enter the information into their system or into their, which then goes into the ABI system, the Automated Broker Interface System, which is the U.S. Customs system, which then gets transmitted to CBP. Your documents can be electronically released, or it may pop up as that documents are required. If your item is electronically released, it'll just come back to the Customs broker and say the items are released. The Customs broker will take the documents to the carrier. The products will be released from the airport warehouse and then loaded onto a truck and then sent to, finally delivered over to you on the dock. If your items go documents required, what will happen is that the Customs broker actually has to take all of the documents, the hard copy documents, to the Customs office, and the Customs officer will review those documents and then determine if they have any additional questions and either release it or ask for additional information until they're satisfied to release the products. And then it goes through the same thing. Once the items have been released, then your Customs broker will take the documents over to the carrier for the items to be released, and then they'll be put on a truck on destination to your dock or wherever the ship-to location is. So what are the entry documents? I'll show you a couple of forms here. The 3461 is the entry or the immediate delivery. This is the way most shipments are done so that you can get your products the minute that they come into the dock or come into the port of entry. This is an immediate release of products for delivery to the end destination, and then you have a certain time period before you can do the complete entry summary, which is 7501. So generally you'll do both 3461 and the 7501 form. You don't always have to do the 3461. You're just asking for that if you want to get your products delivered to you as soon as possible. So I would say probably 98% of the entries that come in have an immediate entry immediate delivery type document, the form 3461. You always have to file the 7501 form. This is the final submission to customs. This is the document that's going to state the HTS codes, the amount of duty that's paid, and the fees and taxes that are paid. It will also be accompanied with your commercial invoice or your pro forma invoice, which would also have all of the ship to, the quantity, the description. All of that information that's on your commercial invoice is used to generate the 7501 form. In addition to that, what's presented to customs would be the packing list if you have one. If you don't have a packing list, and customs decides to stop the shipment because they see some type of red flag in your paperwork, they will open up every box in your shipment. So if you have multiple boxes and you don't have a packing list that explains what's in what box, they'll open up every box, and that just adds more time to the exam part of it, and then you may accrue additional fees from the carrier's warehouse while the products are in storage there until the items are actually released from customs. Once again, the evidence to right to make entry, this is your bill of lading or airway bill, depending on the mode of transportation. And then any other documents that are required. So we talked about things like your certificate of origin, if it's under NAFTA, so your NAFTA certificate of origin, your FCC documents, TSCA documents, and a license if you are importing or temporarily importing a ITAR commodity and requires a DSP 61 or a DSP 73. Those types of documents also have to go with the entry documents. The last thing here is the import bond. You don't always need an import bond. The import bond's there if you're not paying the duties at the time of entry. So if you're doing the immediate release, you have to have a bond in place because it guarantees the payments of your customs fees and duty. If you're just doing a 7501 form and you're paying for the goods the minute that you submit the 7501 form, you don't have to have a bond. But generally, if you're dealing with a customs broker, they're going to request that you have a bond. And you can either go to an insurance company that will do the bonds for you, or you can buy bonds from your customs brokers. You can do it entry by entry, or you can have a bond that covers all of them. And I would recommend that you get a bond that covers all of them and to go through an insurance agency. If you go through your customs broker, there's generally a fee that's going to be applied to that, so you're just going to pay more for it. So here's an example of the 7501 form. I'm going to get off the PowerPoint slide here and then go to the actual PDF form here. This is not completed, but this will just give you an idea of what the 7501 form looks like. Some of the key things you want to take a look at is that your filer code entry number, this is what's going to be assigned to identify your particular shipment that's coming in. The first three letters of the filer code are that of the customs broker that's submitting the items for you. Okay, the entry type is the type of entry that goes in. So you heard earlier someone ask a question about an informal entry versus a formal entry. We'll talk about that. But depending on what type of entry that the item comes under, there will be a number here that identifies what the correct entry type or what type of entry comes in. Down at the bottom is where you're going to show where your duties and taxes that are and any fees that are required for that entry, and that will all be located in here. This section right here is something that the customs broker puts in. It will be by line item, but it's identified by HTS code. So while you may have 30 items listed on your commercial invoice, if they all have the same HTS code, you're only going to have one line item on this 7501 form. So you do want to make sure to talk to your customs broker if you want to make it easier for you to do audits or identify which products are coming in. Let's say if they're different part numbers but they have the same HTS code, you can have them do separate line items. But for the most part, customs brokers will automatically, because their systems will do this automatically, is consolidate everything with the same HTS code on one line. So you won't see part numbers in this area unless you request them to put something in there. It won't automatically do that. Okay. The next form here, I go back, is the 3461 form. So once again, this is the entry and immediate delivery form. I'll just show you this real quick. If you are using this form to get your items delivered quickly, then you want to make sure that you have this as part of your packet. This here will just have some basic information on here. It'll have the HTS number and of course all of the shipping information, your airway bill, bill of lading information on here. But what you won't find is how much customs duties and fees are here. So once again, this is just to release your product so that they can be delivered. And once you file this, then you have a certain time frame that you have to file the entry documents and then pay for your customs duties and fees. So what are the types of entries? There's different types of entries that will come in, and there's different types of releases for the products depending on the nature of your shipment. So depending on the value and the type of product that you're bringing in and the purpose of the import, you'll have different types of entries. So if you have an item that's coming in as U.S. goods return, that's a different type of entry that may come in. If you're having an item that will temporarily come in through the U.S., it's transiting through the U.S., say it's coming in from China and going to the U.S. and then be transported up to Canada, that'll be a different type of entry. If you're bringing something in temporarily for things like repair and return, you may be bringing that item in under a certain type of entry, which is like a temporary import bond or TIB. The transportation industry or entries are those that I just explained, where you might be bringing something into the U.S. and transiting through the U.S. to another country. That's quite common if you're bringing things in, let's say, from Mexico, and then the end destination is Canada, and they're trucking it through the U.S. You may be doing that T&E or the transportation entry. There's the formal and informal entries, which is the 01 will show up in that entry status up there and that entry number, and an informal entry, which is 11. And that's done based on the values as well as the Section 321 low value shipments. The low value shipments, if it's under 2,500 or under 2004, most commodities, you can do the Section 321 or an informal entry. If it's textiles, there's a little bit lower value there, like $250 for you to do the informal entry. And the reason for that is that there's a lot of controls around textiles. There are additional fees and duties and limitations to certain types of products that can be brought in from certain countries. So they only allow the $250 mark for textiles that can come in. In addition to that, you may be subject to anti-dumping or countervailing duties. If your products may be subject to that, and I gave the example earlier of ball bearings, depending on who the manufacturer is, you may be subject to some of those additional duties, and that requires a different type of entry when it comes in along with different documentation. And generally, if you have something that's subject to another government agency, your items are going to go formal, and that's because they're going to require, let's say, the FDA certification or the FCC certification. This next chart here is just kind of a timeline of the entry process. So you have 5 days from the time that the products come into the port to file a declaration to customs, meaning the immediate release of the products. You have a total of 15 days to submit the entry summary and the payment of duties to customs. So you do have to, at the time that you submit the 7501 form, unless you have other authorization from customs, that you have to pay those duties and taxes at the time that you do the entry. If you're doing things like a temporary import bond where the items are coming into the U.S. and then they'll be exported out of the U.S., and that's a TIB, a temporary import bond, you have up to a year to get those items back out before you actually have to pay duties and taxes. If the item isn't exported within the year, you'll have to pay the fees and the taxes and duties assessed to that product as if it was being imported, and then any interest payments that are on there. What happens is when your entry, after a certain time period, it will be liquidated. And what that means when it's liquidated is that customs cannot come back and charge additional fees. Basically, the entry is done. And generally that's within the 90-day time frame with when the liquidation happens. And you'll get liquidation notices from customs. They usually come on, it's like a postcard size type document. Sometimes they're pink, sometimes they're yellow. I've seen the white ones too. And that's just a notification. That's not actually saying that it's liquidated. You actually have to get information from your customs broker that the entry has been liquidated. And just keep in mind that even though you may be bringing things in, until the product or until the entry has been liquidated, customs can call back the product. And it doesn't happen a lot, but I have seen it. And what I mean by that is that if you have your product, you're bringing it in, and then you're going to resell the product to somebody else, and that all happens within the 10-day time frame that your product's being imported, customs can come back 6 months later and say, you know what, we don't believe that your the entry was done correctly, or the value was wrong, or the items were classified, or we believe that there's a mismarking on your product, so you need to send them back to customs. And then you're kind of in a bind at that point in time. That doesn't mean you have to keep your products for a year. Just keep in mind that customs can come back and ask for those products in a year. And if you can't produce them, then there may be some penalties that you have to pay. And I'll stop there to see if there's any questions on the import process.
Yes, I want to go back to one of the first questions we asked because I think I heard you answer it, but I just want to verify. This is, what is the value limitation on an informal entry, section 321?
Yeah, it's $2,000 for most products and $250 for textiles.
Okay, yep, thank you. Okay. Next question here. If a company wants to handle and submit their own entries, would they do so through the ABI system, or if not, how is it done? So if they didn't want to use a broker.
Yes, it should be done through the ABI system. And what companies would do is have an interface from their system to the ABI system. I believe you can still do it manually through typing on a 7501 form, but I believe customs, if you're bringing in a lot of things, it needs to be done in the interface to the automated broker interface system. So you'll have to work with your IT system to see if there's a software package that you can purchase. And there's lots of companies out there that provide that type of service that will integrate into the ABI system. So you just want to take a look and see if it's easy for you to do that. If you have a 1 or 2 line item entry and you're just doing it every every other month or once a quarter, then you could probably do it through the paper format. But just keep in mind that if you're going to submit your own entries, you have to be in the port of entry where your products are being submitted or being imported. So if you are located in Denver, Colorado, and your items are being imported into Seattle, you have to have somebody in Seattle to provide the documentation and work with the carrier and drop the documents off. So that's just one of the things that you need to take a look at if you are doing your self-imports. You can always request that the items be sent to another, like do a temporary import bond or T&E, transportation entry, for your products to be moved from one port to the other port. So let's say you want your products to be moved from Seattle to Denver. You can do a T&E to move the products, but you still have to have somebody in Seattle to provide all the documentation.
Okay. And one more question here. Can a customs broker assign HTS codes for my products?
They can if you've given them authorization to do so. So once again, they have to have a power of attorney. And that power of attorney would say that they're able to do customs business on your behalf. And so when you do a power of attorney, you can make it as generic as you want, or you can list out specific tasks that they can do. If you don't want a customs broker assigning HTS codes to your products, then a couple of things I would tell you to do is to say that in the power of attorney that they don't have the ability to do that, or two, set up procedures and processes with your customs brokers to make sure that they're getting the correct HTS code from you. But they certainly can do HTS codes for you, and you'll see later on, I don't recommend that your customs brokers assign HTS codes for you on your behalf because they don't know your product. Depending on what your product is, you may need technical specifications and product information, especially if you're dealing with things like textiles, and even things like screws and bolts can be a difficult task. I'll just give you an example of a screw. You have to decide, you have to know what the material is that it's made out of. So is it steel, is it copper, is it plastic, how long is the screw, what type of a screw is it, is it a machine screw, is the nut coming with it, is it really a bolt? So there's lots of different things. You actually have to have the specifications of the screw to assign the HTS code. So my recommendation, I know I'm answering more than what the question was asking, would be not to have your customs broker assign the HTS code unless they have an expert on staff that is familiar with your product, has the ability to get into your systems and look at those specifications, or unless you're providing specifications or documentation that will give them the ability to assign the correct HTS code.
Great, thank you. We have more questions coming in, but I'd like to just continue with the slides at this point, and then make sure we can get through the material, and then we'll take as many of them as we can get to at another point. Thanks.
Perfect. So moving on to the next section, so what can go wrong with your import? So some of the most common errors that brokers see is really dealing with the documents and the information that's on the documents. I'll say 9 times out of 10, the brokers can't read the documents. And the reason for that is as the documents go from one carrier to the customs broker to the freight forwarder and then to the customs broker on the other end, the documents are being regenerated. And so one of the things that I recommend to people is that your documents, you always put 3 or 4 copies of each document with the shipment. That way each person along the line has a copy of the document. So if you have someone picking it up for and putting it on a truck while it's being taken to the airport, the truck driver takes a copy. Once it gets to the airport, freight forwarder takes a copy, then the carrier will take a copy, then your customs broker will need a copy. So I always recommend doing 3 or 4 copies of the documents and making sure that they're legible copies. The other thing is to email those documents to your customs broker or send them electronically to your customs broker, fax them as long as the fax is legible. At least give them a copy of those documents prior to the products actually arriving in the port of entry. The other thing that will get you in trouble a lot is your vague or no descriptions. So your documentation, when you're shipping something in, make sure you're not using those part number descriptions that you have in your ERP system, because generally those part numbers are something that's unique to your company. It may have a product name, but it doesn't tell customs what it is. So if it's a Dell Latitude 3461, but that doesn't tell customs that that's a laptop computer. Really, you want your descriptions to tell them that it's a laptop computer. For the example of a screw, you want it to say a 3-inch stainless steel machine screw. You want it to make sure that the description is clear to customs and to your customs broker, because what they'll look at is the description and the HTS code, and if they can't line it up, what they will do is ask for more information, which will hold up your shipment as it goes into, as it's trying to clear. In addition to that, you may have the wrong or no country of origin listed. It's a requirement under U.S. customs regulations to have the country of origin as well as the country of origin marking. And I know we had a question earlier about having a wrong country of origin listed on the documentation and opening up the box and seeing that there's a country of origin label that's different than what's on the documentation. That will always get you in trouble. If they stop the shipment and examine the shipment and see that there's a difference, they'll hold the shipment and they can give you fines and penalties on that. So make sure that you always have the correct country of origin. You may even ask for a certificate of origin from the manufacturer. It's not a requirement by customs unless you're bringing the items in under a certain trade agreement, but you may want to get one anyway just so that you have that documented. Valuation errors. So we had this question earlier as well, is that if the currency is not listed on the commercial invoice, it becomes an issue with your customs broker. They're probably going to assume that's in US dollars. So if the commercial invoice, the pro forma invoice is listed, it doesn't show what type of currency in there, so US dollars. Don't just put the dollar sign, because it could be Hong Kong dollars, it could be Canadian dollars. You want to make sure that you're saying what currency it is, so US dollars with US and then the dollar sign, or Canada with the dollar sign. So you want to make sure that the currency is listed on the commercial invoice. And then of course missing documentation, and I'll say 9 times out of 10 this is the one that always occurs, is that if you're bringing in certain items that are subject to other government agency regulations, you don't have the proper documents. I'll tell you, in my past experience, one of the big issues were things that were sent for trade shows. So your marketing department will send over T-shirts or pens overseas to give out at the trade shows, but not all of those things were given away, so they want to bring back the remainder. One of the things you have to be aware of is that your ballpoint pens are subject to TSCA statements, because the ink in the pens are toxic and require a TSCA statement. So you want to make sure that you have different procedures in place to address all the different types of items that can be exported out. Same thing with textiles. So if they're sending T-shirts out, now they want to bring back T-shirts. There's a lot of information around textiles that you need. Where was the fabric done? Where is the country of origin for those products, and the percentile of cotton and different things that you need for textile items to come in. So what will happen if you don't have the correct information? Well, customs can hold your shipment and examine it, and that always adds costs and also time delay. If customs examines the product, they can either examine it with someone there or they can examine it on their own, but you will have to pay for those exam fees. And until customs can get to the exam, you may be paying storage fees to the carrier for it being in their bonded warehouse. If you can't find the documents or produce the documents, customs may seize the shipment, and then you're just out all of those products that come in. They can assess fines and penalties just like any other government agency, as well as if your HTS code is wrong, they can assign or assess the interest that was owed for any duties that were not paid. They can also conduct focus assessments and put you higher on the list for focus assessments, or come in and audit your program. I've also seen customs come in and shut down warehouses until they have put proper controls in place for things being imported in. They can do things like CF-28s and 29s, and basically a 28 is a request for additional information. That generally happens after the import, but it can happen while the item is being imported, where they're requesting additional information on things like how did you come up with the valuation, how did you come up with the HTS code, and request things like product brochures and information in regards to how the product is classified. And you do have to respond to that within a certain time frame, or they're just going to decide what the classification should be and assign you and assess you some fines and penalties. So what are the best practices, or how can you help your customs broker and help your company to ensure that you have a seamless import process? So you want to make sure, if you have a customs broker, my first recommendation is to provide them a copy of your classification database. And if you're always updating your classification database, make sure that you have a periodic update that you can send to them. I've seen companies where they provide their classifications out on their websites, or they FTP their classification databases to their broker once a week. I've seen where companies have provided access to their customs broker to come into their systems so they can see the classification in real time. So there's different ways of doing that, but I would always say you want to provide your broker a copy of how you've classified your products. You also want to make sure that you have clear and concise work instructions with your broker. A lot of companies have no procedures in place to deal with their customs broker. So if an item gets stopped at customs, the customs broker has no idea who to call. And one of the things that you'll see is that your supplier that you're purchasing your products from is probably going to put your purchasing person's contact name and information on the export documentation because that's what was put on the purchase order. So you want to make sure that your customs broker knows who to contact and not call the purchasing person because they're not going to have the information most of the time to provide back to the customs broker on things like classification and other government agency documents. That will be either your compliance department or the person that's responsible for your compliance with the import requirements. If that's your purchasing person, then that may be the right person, but you want to make sure you have those work instructions on who they contact. And when do they contact the company? So if they see that the value is wrong or they suspect the value is wrong, that they contact you at a certain time frame. Some companies I've seen have set up in place where they will send the documents or the 7501 form to the company before they're submitted to customs so that the company can review the information on the 7501 form to make sure that it's correct. And if there's any changes, then they send it back to the customs broker, and then the customs broker will submit the 7501 form to customs. Now, of course, you've got a short time frame there. You've got that 15-day period from the time that the product's entered into the U.S. to the time that the 7501 form needs to be submitted. So you have to work pretty quickly. But once again, you should have some very clear work instructions on how to do that. Then who's supposed to answer the CF-28s and CF-29s? So we talked about that, the CF-28s, 29s, that's really requesting additional information or it's assessing fines and penalties to your products. Sometimes customs brokers will just go ahead and respond. I don't recommend that because once again, if there's a request for information on a transaction or on the classification of a product, your customs broker isn't going to have that information unless they have access into all your systems, which they probably don't. You're going to want to be able to respond with proper product brochures, or if it's things like valuation, you want to be able to provide the purchase order, a contract, whatever the customs is requesting to see. So you'll want your customs broker to come back to you to ask for the information. And then the other thing you want to make sure that's in those procedures is how do you receive copies of your paperwork? I've had a lot of clients that have come back and said, well, my customs broker has all those documents, so if I need them, I'll just come back, I'll just go ask them. Well, customs does not see it that way. You, as the importer, are responsible for keeping records yourself. So your customs broker has their own requirements as a customs broker to keep documents, but you as the importer should also have a copy of all of your import documents. And you should have a procedure in place to receive copies of those import documents. One of the things that generally happens is that your customs broker will send the entry documents with the bills on a monthly basis. If you need to see those entries beforehand so that you can audit them, you'll want to set up some type of process with them to get those documents quicker. And they'll probably charge you for it, but it's a good practice to get those documents as soon as the item comes in, or right after they file it, or even before they file it, like the example I gave before where the company is looking at the 7501 forms before they're submitted. You just want to make sure you get those copies and that you're filing those properly. You'll also want to train your customs broker. It's always a good idea that your customs broker knows a little information about your company, what your company does, and what the products are. It doesn't necessarily have to go into the details to where they'd be doing HTS codes, but it always helps the customs broker to understand your business. So if you're a reseller or a distributor, they understand that you're not the manufacturer and that you may have to go back and ask for additional information. And so they won't be hounding you every hour to ask for information on classification. So it's just a good idea to just train your customs broker on your products and your company and how your company does business. In addition to that, you'll want to talk about how you get pre-alerts sent to your customs broker. So your supplier, you'll always want to work with your supplier to have them send copies of the shipping documentation at the time of export of that country. So you may have 12 hours, you may have 24 hours, you may have 2 weeks before the items arrive in the port of import or port of entry into the U.S. The best practice is to make sure that those documents get to your customs broker. They can always do that immediate release prior to the items even arriving in the port of entry, so that the minute the items get into the port, they can be released and delivered. So the key thing here is to work with your suppliers and then work with your customs broker to see how those documents are going to get to your customs broker, those pre-alerts. Either your supplier can send them to you and then you send them to your customs broker, or you can have your supplier send to both of you at the same time. But once again, you have to have the contact information for your customs broker as well. You may want to do an automatic interface from your ERP system to your customs broker system. So whether you're using SAP, JD Edwards, an Oracle system, or even a homegrown system, customs brokers will generally decrease the value of their entry fees if you are submitting the documents, but also the information on those shipments electronically. So let me give you an example. If you have a supplier that you do a lot of business with, you have a regular shipment that comes in, and it's 80% of your imports, I'd recommend that you would see if your supplier can supply that information electronically with an interface to your customs broker, or they send the information to you and you can send the information electronically to your customs broker. Because what that does is that takes out the manual entry process of someone looking at the commercial invoice and retyping all the data in to the customs broker system or into the ABI system. So that takes out the manpower that's there, and it has less of a chance of having some type of a mistake or error when the items are being entered into the U.S. So if it's possible to do that automatic interface from your ERP system to the customs broker system, that's the best way to go. Obviously have a main point of contact at your company along with any backup. So while that person's on vacation, who does the customs broker go to if they have questions on an entry? And I'll stop there, Tom, and see if there's any questions.
Yeah, we have some more questions here. One of them on record keeping. Pretty simple question. Just how long do we have to keep records?
It should be 5 years from the date of import.
Okay.
And then just a kind of a note on that too, customs is a little different. If you're used to dealing with export regulations, you can keep them electronic or hard copy. Customs, you have to keep a hard copy unless you get authorization to keep an electronic copy, and that's just a simple letter that's submitted to customs. You can keep them electronically, but you just have to get approval to create or to keep your records electronically versus hard copy.
Great, thanks. This next question is on liquidation callbacks. Regarding the liquidation callback, what if it was already consumed? For example, an aircraft part was imported, then sold, and already installed on an aircraft, likely in another country.
That's a good question. It's really up to the customs to decide. So if you have enough information, or if you have, let's say, a similar product or the same product, but let's say a different serial number, and there's a question, let's say, on the country of origin, customs may just take the other article that you have, take a look at it. It depends on what the callback's for. If it's things where they think it's a like a what's the word I'm looking for, like a fraudulent part, they're going to ask you to get every effort to get those parts back. So it really just depends on, my wonderful phrase, it depends. It depends on what the callback's for. They may just accept documentation other than the parts to resolve the issue, but in other situations they're going to ask you to get every effort that you can to get the products back. And of course, that's not always easy to do, especially in that scenario, and it also goes for things like retail products where they're already sent out to the stores and being sold to consumers. And if that's the case, that's when you have to get with your customers to recall the products. I mean, that's where you see some of these recalls that come back. So it really just depends on the situation. Customs will sometimes work it out with you if you've tried every effort to get the product back. And you have documented proof that you've sent items to the customer. And let's say for the example, the aircraft item has already been consumed, maybe that part has already been replaced. You know, if it's a tire, for example, and the tire has already been replaced because it's been used, then you can get documents from your customer saying that that's the case. It doesn't mean that customs isn't going to fine you if there's some type of penalty that's assessed to it, but it's something, it just really, once again, depends on the situation.
Great, thanks. Here's another question. If I'm bringing an item temporarily in to perform tests and it will be exported after 6 months, what type of entry should I do?
My recommendation for things of that nature is to do a temporary import bond. There is some document or some work that has to be put in place when you're using a temporary bond. But basically under a temporary bond you can bring items in for a year, and in best case that would be things like certification. So I'll just use the aircraft part for an example. If you're bringing a foreign-made aircraft part into the U.S. to be FAA certified and then you're shipping it back out, I would recommend doing a TIB, because what that does is you don't have to pay duties on those items when they come into the U.S. if there's duties that are assessed to the part. And then you can just export them back out. So in that particular case, even for a repaired item, I would do a TIB just to bring them in and out. That way you don't have to pay the duties and taxes on it. But you do have to make sure that you're keeping track of that product as it's in your repair center or in your certification lab. Make sure that it's the same serial part number that's coming in and going out. If the item can't be repaired, then you just have to note that the item can't be repaired, and you may be subject to the import duties and fees of those items that are coming in. It just depends on the product and their classification and duty of those items.
All right, thank you. We'll continue on then.
Okay. This last piece here is how to choose a customs broker. Believe it or not, this can take a lot of time, and you really want to do some research on your customs brokers. There's a lot of different customs brokers out there. You'll know that the express carriers have their own customs brokers, but they also have their freight side of it that will act as customs brokers as well. You'll have lots of mom and pop type shop customs brokers that specialize in certain locations and certain products. So you really want to take a look around at your customs broker to make sure that they have the experience in your product line, that they have experience in things like, if they have experience in your product line, they'll know whether or not other government agency documents are required. They'll also be able to help classify the products or give you some suggestions on classification. They'll also recognize things that are wrong classification. So you want them to have experience in your industry. If the customs broker has mainly imported electronic parts and you're importing textile products, it's probably not the best choice, because the electronics manufacturer probably has no idea how to deal with different types of textiles and what information needs to be put onto the entry in relation to those textiles, and vice versa. So you want to make sure that customs broker has some experience in your industry, just so that they can help identify some of these other areas that we talked about before. The next piece is that you want to see if they have any capabilities. So if you're looking at doing an interface with your ERP system to your customs broker system, see if they have IT resources. See if they've ever done some type of interface with your ERP system. See if they have their own internal system that's sent directly that's interfaced with the ABI system, and how long they've been using it. I'll tell you, there's a lot of customs brokers out there that are using some homegrown system that's interfaced with ABI, and then they have issues when customs changes something with the ABI system. So you just want to take a look and see what type of resources they have in their IT department. Other things to be looking at, whether they'll pay duties and taxes on your behalf for your company and bill you later. I know that was a question that was earlier on, but you have to take a look at your business practice. If your company wants to hold on to their cash for investment reasons, for interest rates and those types of things, they may want to hold on to their cash for 30 days or 45 days and have your customs broker pay up front, and they may make more money on their investments and their interest than what they would pay to the customs broker for advanced cash fees. So you just got to take a look and work, I would say, work with your tax and accounting departments to see which is the best thing for you. But you want to see if your customs broker can do that. Some of the smaller customs brokers may not have enough cash on hand to pay for your customs duties up front. So you want to take a look at the customs broker and what their ability is to pay on your behalf. You'll also want to see what kind of experience that your customs brokers have. Are they working with different types of carriers? So I know there are some customs brokers out there that really only work with air. There are some that are only work with ocean carriers. So you want to see that your customs broker has experience with all the modes of transportation that you do with your products. The other thing that you want to do is look at the charges that your customs broker will charge you. And so this is kind of one of those underlying things and you really have to look at. I've seen numerous contracts, even with the express carriers, where they will say an entry is $50 or $125. But then you get your first bill and it's $250 for the fees that the customs brokers charge you for the entry. And the reason for that is that they have a set number, they have set fees based on things like how many commercial invoices are part of the shipment, how many line items are on the shipment. So I'll say generally the express carriers will go up to 5 line items on a commercial invoice, and I think maybe 1 or 2 commercial invoices. So if you have a shipment that's consolidated that has 3 or 4 commercial invoices, and each commercial invoice may have 10 or 20 line items, they're going to charge you $1.50 for each line item that they have to enter into the ABI system, and for each commercial invoice they may charge you another $5. So this is how your fees keep going up. So you want to look for those hidden fees that they have. You'll also want to look for things like other fees if you're dealing with other government agency documents. They may charge you an extra $10 or $15 to submit those documents for you. If they're going to make copies of your documentation, so how much is it going to cost to get copies of your documentation? They should be providing to you anyway, in my opinion, but sometimes they will charge you for that. Some freight forwarders may send you copies of your documents electronically, maybe on a CD or through an FTP site, or you can download them directly from their site. See what those fees are. There may be additional fees for that. If they're going to classify your product, they're going to charge you for a classification of those products. If they're going to represent you through an exam of your products, they're going to charge you for that. So there's different things you want to take a look at that they're going to charge you for. Another thing would be document transfer fees. So especially if you're dealing with like FedEx or UPS. FedEx or UPS will charge a document transfer fee to send to your customs broker, and then your customs broker will charge you a document transfer fee to give the documents back to them. So you just want to take a look at all those hidden fees because it can get very costly. So while you think you're getting a good deal on your entry, let's say $25 per entry, it may end up being a heck of a lot more if your normal shipments have lots of line items, lots of commercial invoices, and require other government fees. So it's all a negotiating tactic when you're looking at your customs broker. So what are the best practices for your relationship with your customs broker? You really want to make sure that you're auditing your customs broker and looking at metrics for your customs broker. So how long does it take for them to get to you when the item is stopped? You'll also want to audit all of your entries. So the recommendation is to do a 100% audit of all of your entries. That's looking to make sure that the customs broker entered everything correctly into the ABI system and onto the 7501 form correctly. So you're looking at your value and the quantity per Schedule B number that's listed on your 7501 form, making sure they entered the correct HTS code, they've entered the correct country of origin, making sure the duty was paid on time and that the items were entered in. The 7501 form was entered in within that 15 days. You're going to know if it wasn't because you'll get a nice call from customs. But you just want to make sure you're auditing all of that information. You also want to make sure you have an import compliance program. So if you're used to exporting, you probably have an export compliance program. Well, you also need an import compliance program. It's a little bit different on how things are set up, but you'll still have some of the main things such as classification of your products and then interaction with the government entities. But you do want to make sure that you document your import procedures and processes and who's responsible for that. The next thing is try to become CTPAT certified or ISA certified. CTPAT is the security program for your supply chain. It's a voluntary program at this point in time. Really what it's doing is looking at the supply chain and security measures that are put in place all the way from the beginning, from which your supplier manufactures the products, puts them in in a package going through your freight forwarder, and then all the way delivered to your facility. So that's looking at things like, are there badge readers in place? Is there a big chance of items being placed on the truck? So what's the security that's around that? They're really trying to prevent terrorism and things being put into these packages and coming into the U.S. ISA is the Importer Self-Assessment Program. This is where you would perform your own self-audits, and that would remove you from the focused assessment pool that Customs would look at. So a focused assessment is really a Customs formal audit, and every company that's an importer is part of that pool, and they just start pulling names to go in and do a focus assessment. And if you've ever been part of a focus assessment, it is ugly. It can last months. You may have a customs officer on site for many, many months until the focus assessment is done. So if you're doing your own internal audits, which is really what the ISA is about, then you'll be pulled out of that focus assessment pool. The benefit of CTPAT is that you'll have less of a chance of exams, but once again, it really kind of depends on the product that you're importing. I have had clients that have been CTPAT certified and still get lots of exams, but it just depends on the product and where it's coming from. But part of being CTPAT certified is to take you off and have less exams and have less formal or doc required entries that come in. You want to make sure that you have good record-keeping practices. So we talked about that you should have your own copies of your entry documents. A good rule of thumb is that if Customs requests a copy of your documents, you should be able to pull those up within 24 hours, and that's really a business day. But you don't want to tell Customs, oh, it's going to take me 2 weeks. I have to go to Iron Mountain and pull the box out of storage. That's not a good answer that Customs wants to hear. You should be able to pull up your documents within 24 to 48 hours. 24 hours is probably the best practice there. Have procedures in place for discrepancy in shipments received. So as your items are coming in and your receiving personnel are looking through it, you want to make sure that receiving knows what to do. One, when the quantity doesn't match the paperwork, because you'll have to amend your entry to make sure that the proper quantity is on there. Let's say there's a part number that's not on the commercial invoice, or they sent the wrong part, and that happens from time to time. You want your receiving department to know what to do. And I think one of the other questions earlier was about the country of origin was different than what was on the paperwork. You want to make sure that your receiving department understands these are the things they need to look at when they're receiving the products in at the dock, and then who to alert with those types of items so that those entries can be amended immediately. And you'll want to train all of your employees that are part of the entry process or the import process, so that includes your purchasing department. What types of information do they need to put on the purchase order so that the supplier knows what to do when the items come in? You also want to look at your logistics staff, so that it's part of the routing guide and instructions of what your freight forwarders and customs brokers are supposed to do, who they're supposed to contact. Import staff, so if you're lucky enough to have an import compliance department or a compliance staff, that they're always trained and up to date on what the regulation changes are. And once again, your receiving staff and shipping department, so that they can look at any discrepancies that may happen when the items are brought into the U.S. And I'll stop there and see if there's any questions.
Yes, we have a couple more questions. This first one says, what are the advantages or disadvantages of filing Section 321?
Well, generally on Section 321, they're usually done automatically, and it's based on the value of the products that come in. Under 321, you don't have to wait for the liquidation notices. They're usually done right away, and you won't pay the import fees that are required when you're doing a formal or an informal entry.
Okay, great. Another question on customs brokers. It says brokers are required to consult the importer to make entry, correct? I've had a broker simply clear per the commercial invoice and enter it incorrectly when they were supposed to contact me to clarify the information.
Well, technically, if they have a power of attorney, they can do the entry. So once again, it deals with your process and the communication with the broker, but your broker can go ahead and import those goods because they have a power of attorney to do so. So it really is your relationship. If your broker is doing that and not alerting you that they're doing so, then it's not a very good customs broker. I would suggest changing, especially if it's happening a lot. There are always customs brokers that happens. Say something's that the customs broker's notified on the 14th day before the item's done, so they go ahead and do the import. They may be doing you a favor at that point in time of doing it without your consent. But you really need to work with your customs broker and have those written work instructions so that they know who to contact. And once again, I'll be honest with you, customs brokers have a lot of turnover. Not all, but most of them do have a lot of turnover with their import analysts. And so you may want to do this periodic training with their personnel and making sure that you know who that they're dealing with, especially if you're dealing with some of these bigger customs brokers, even things like FedEx and UPS with their customs department. You may be dealing with a different person every day. You may not be able to do the training. So what's key there is to make sure that you have a lot of information that's put on the commercial invoice. So you have your supplier put a lot of things like contact information, contact so-and-so prior to entry. If you're sending things like through the express carriers, FedEx, UPS, they have the right to make the entry. They actually use it in their name. They have special authority to clear all those documents and all of the freight off their planes quickly. So if you have an important shipment or something that may be, let's say, under the ITAR that goes under a license or has other government agency requirements, don't use the express carriers, because they're going to automatically clear the goods, and they won't deal with licenses. ITAR licenses. So if you're shipping something ITAR, you can use FedEx, but don't use FedEx to clear your goods. You can always put broker select on the FedEx or UPS system, which means that they're not going to act as your broker. They're going to go to whatever customs broker that you've designated to clear the goods. And so they'll do like a temporary release or temporary, like in transit, or move the items over to in bond, but they have to get that freight released because they're consolidating all of the freight. So that's why they have the special treatment, and that's really just the express carriers that can do that. So I'm not sure if I answered the question or raised more questions, but you always want to have that relationship with your customs broker and make sure you have those procedures in place, because that will happen a lot if they're releasing stuff without your permission, especially if they have a power of attorney, they can do so.
Great. We have one more question, so I will just put it out there. If anybody has additional questions, we have a few more minutes left before the time ends on the webinar. Go ahead and submit those through the Q&A toolbar on your screen. So the last question we have, and unless other folks submit more, would be, should a secondary market company use the USGR entry at all? We don't manufacture any of the product we own or sell, and customs often want the manufacturer's affidavit from the manufacturer. Should we stay away from USGR even though we can prove it other ways?
You know, that's kind of a long question. I'd have to know a little bit more information. But if you're looking at, when you say USGR, I'm assuming that's U.S. goods returned. It's always required to have a manufacturer's affidavit when the goods are U.S. goods returned. So if you don't have the manufacturer's affidavit, I suggest not using it. But you really have to look at what the duties and fees are. If your item's duty-free, don't use U.S. goods returned. It doesn't make sense because you have all this extra paperwork you have to do. But if your duty is 3 or 4% and it's a high-value item, you may not have any other choice than to use U.S. goods returned. So really what the question is if you have a U.S. goods return, for those that are new to the importing piece of it, U.S. goods returns allows you to bring U.S. goods that have a country of origin of U.S. back to the U.S. Without paying duties and taxes. And there are certain things that you can do. Let's say if a U.S. goods return for repair, if it's U.S. goods return because it was sent overseas for repair, there are certain situations where you can use that, and you really have to take a look at it. But you do have to have that manufacturer's affidavit. It's a requirement every time. So you really have to look at your business and see what makes best practices, because I know it is difficult to get those manufacturers affidavit, and then you can also do it yourself. But I will tell you that customs will will come back and ask. I've seen it lots of times where they come back with the CF-28 asking for additional information or a specific certificate of origin or proof that the item was manufactured in the U.S. So you got to do your best effort to try to get the manufacturer's affidavit from the manufacturer, even if you don't have a relationship with that manufacturer.
Great, thanks. And here's one last question. If the express carriers clear the goods under their tax ID, is the company still held accountable?
Yes, they are. While like FedEx or UPS has their name as the importer of record, they're really not. You as the importer, you are actually importer of record. So there's just special circumstances for the express carriers. So if you have the shipments, I always say, make sure you have clear instructions with FedEx and on your commercial invoices to tell your suppliers what to put on there and who to contact. And once again, if you have ITAR licenses, you still want to make sure that they're not going to those express carriers. But the answer to your question is that no, your company is still liable for all of the information that FedEx submits on your behalf.
Great, thanks. Well, with that, I'd like to wrap it up, and thank you, Marcy, for taking us through that information. It was very helpful, and I hope that we were able to answer all of the questions that were submitted. If anybody does have additional needs or questions that weren't touched on here or a complicated situation that we couldn't deal with, please don't hesitate to contact us offline, and we will do our best to get you the information and the help that you need. And then just one final reminder about the slides and the recording of this session. You can visit our website, which is exportsolutionsinc.com, typically within a week. If you click on the webinar tab at the top of that website, then it'll take you to the page where you can download a copy of these slides and view a recording of this session. So anybody who wants to go back and record that or use the slides for your internal purposes, certainly welcome to do that. I just want to thank Marcy again, thank all of you. I hope that you have a good Wednesday afternoon, and we hope to see you again on a future webinar. Thank you.